Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to The Top. Last time, we talked about the 10 all-time best Girl Meets World episodes. This time, not so much. While the vast majority of this show has either been passable or genuinely good at the very least, or exceptional at the very most, there's just no escaping the fact that even this show has delivered a few less than stellar finished products. So, let's jump right in with number 5.
I've been waiting for a day like this.
We start things off with a bloated, pointless, and complete waste of an episode. It's bad enough that the love triangle that infected this show was overplayed by the time the Texas trilogy was done, but spending 22 minutes doing absolutely nothing in anticipation of its end was just as grating. There was no reason for this episode to exist given how it's structured and how it operates, and more than that, it's so easy to see how we could have gotten a much better episode out of it, even if it meant dipping much further into the Boy Meets World parallels and actually developing Evan as a character. It also doesn't help that the only reason there is a parallel to begin with is because Riley apparently fell off the bus. Seriously. And there's a really questionable scene where Maya is getting chastised for saving Farkle, even though Farkle broke a rule which required him to be saved. Seriously. There are some good moments within even this episode, but its blatant existence as merely premeditated setup for a part 2 that also wasn't as good as it could have been makes this one too sinful not to mention here. Throw in these atonal dream sequences that dive way too deep into the realms of corny and campy, and there you go. No lesson learned, nothing much gained, and a cast of characters sitting around talking for 22 minutes, but not in the good way. It's never aggressively bad, but still not an episode anyone needed.
On the edge of something wonderful.
Girl Meets Fish gets way more flack than it ever deserved, and some of the people giving it that flack must have been asleep for the more problematic episodes. But even still, yeah, it's a bad episode, but for some interesting reasons. I talk a lot about functionality and the logic behind how movies and shows are designed, and this represents a rare example of an episode that functions just like it should, but fails because of that. The whole point here is to create a partially film noir aesthetic and give Augie not just the focus, but the perspective. Unfortunately, that perspective makes the entire endeavor come off as overly cheesy and gives it more in common with a World of Terror episode than anything else. But even still, there are things that work here. Fish Store Phil is a genuine blast and the funniest part about the episode, and unlike Ski Lodge Part 1, there is a bit more of a point here. But it's debatable whether or not anyone actually learned that point since everyone in class found a way to kill multiple fish, which is not only improbable but kind of dark. Plus, this episode struggles with balancing that film noir style with the elements meant to be taken more seriously, at least as seriously as you can take it, since taking fish home has apparently been a thing for a while now, but nobody ever brings it up before or since, so all of this might not even be completely canon. Despite a valiant attempt at conveying something unique, Girl Meets Fish flounders as an episode because even the functional parts aren't particularly good, making the bad parts stick out even more, but still nowhere near as mind-bogglingly bad as the actual worst episode.
Chances, moments happen every.
Being almost a complete retread of the worst aspects of Texas Part 3 is the least of this episode's problems. The larger issue is that the lesson of sense and sensibility that was emphasized here was learned by nobody, or learned in such a wrong-headed way that it compromises the resolution. The New Year's resolution, right? Anyone? The idea of being both emotionally and logically sound in your reasoning is great, but nobody embraces that idea. Farkle is not wrong often, but he's wrong here, because he thinks it makes sense to deliver that ultimatum to Riley about telling Lucas the truth, but never once considers, oh I don't know, how anyone else would feel. It makes some sense that Farkle, being who he is, wouldn't take to sensibility as easily as sense, but early in the episode he seems to get it, and later on he clearly doesn't. If this had been framed to allow Farkle to understand sensibility as a way to better comprehend his own feelings, which he and Smackle both have trouble with at times, then we probably have a really good episode. And even if this lesson was framed in such a way as to say that it's not an easy thing to learn, then they probably should have made it into a two-parter. To his credit, Farkle does eventually grow into someone who seems to have a better understanding of both, but relative to his other much more valuable experiences, I'd be hard-pressed to call New Year a character-building episode on that front. And before I forget, let's very briefly mention everyone's favorite creeper. Charlie is a bad character, mainly because his one and only role in the show is to actively pursue and then get rejected by Riley, and the way he goes about doing that is uncomfortable at best, as the show itself admits. But then, he has moments of understanding which don't cleanly fit into how he went about doing things before, so he's either two-faced or just has an inconsistent character design, but at least he's not this guy. All that said, it's probably not a coincidence that he never appears in a single episode after this one. But, as with most episodes, there are still some nice moments in there, and definitely a couple of really good jokes. But, Girl Meets the New Year fails to deliver anything more valuable than that. At this point, calling the World of Terror episodes underwhelming at best isn't a very interesting or novel observation. We just kind of accept that we'll have to slog through them every season. You can call this a top 6 or 7 if you want, but I'm giving the entire concept of these episodes a spot all their own. The first one was dumb with a contrived Face Your Fears plot ripped straight out of Lord knows how many other shows and movies. The second was even worse, with a nonsensical plot thread and what can best be called dubious connections to other shows. And the third is broken in almost every conceivable way, making even some of the interesting stuff they do mean much less. Case in point, Augie expressing his feelings for Ava could have been a great moment in a real episode, but since he's in a ghost costume and then gets reborn somehow by the end, it takes away any emotional weight a moment like that might have had. All three are bad for very strange but unique reasons, and there was absolutely no reason to make any of them as is, except for maybe the third one, because the central idea was at least conceptually interesting. But if they're going to make these episodes anyways, they might as well work harder at it. Boy Meets World at least had a cameo from one of the greatest witches ever, and there's certainly no shortage of those nowadays. A lot could have been forgiven if Hermione Granger found her way onto the set, or heck, even Ron. He's not nearly as busy these days. You could argue that episodes as stale, flippant, and pointless as these are relatively innocuous, and I would somewhat agree, but I'd rather see a show this great try and stumble as opposed to just twiddling their thumbs for 22 minutes because they got forced into another non-canon Monstober special. Girl Meets STEM wasn't the best incorporation of feminism, but it was an incorporation of feminism. Girl Meets She Don't Like Me was lacking in a few areas, but it still tried to deliver an important and necessary narrative. Girl Meets High School Part 2 was a bit silly, but showing the challenges of a new environment definitely had its high points, and the list goes on. Those episodes will never be confused for the masterclass work of I Am Farkle, but they weren't 22 minutes of nothing. You can make a good episode out of anything, but with 3 attempts here, they just didn't do that. Lord almighty, did they ever get this one wrong? I'm still scratching my head as to how Disney Channel of all networks ever agreed to air such a controversial episode that is so wrong-headed in its approach. Now, I know I just said doing nothing is bad, but what they did here was way worse. Let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. This episode aired out of order, which basically means that characters develop backwards from the high note that Girl Meets Money left them on 2 weeks prior, but that's a minor complaint compared to the major problems. This episode tried to equate an entire social ideology to cheating, one of the few aspects of life with no gray area. Cheating is wrong literally 100% of the time. That's how cheating works. But if you then equate that to communism or communism, then the message becomes that those viewpoints are 100% wrong, which is so comically biased that it could be interpreted as political satire. But it gets worse, because now the subtext essentially reads that America and its democracy is flawless. Now, don't get me wrong, democracy is a good form of government, and America is a great country that I'm thankful to live in, but calling either perfect would be like calling this episode insightful. And what's more, it's made abundantly clear that the cast doesn't even understand the title of the episode and keeps confusing it with communism. Keep in mind that communism and communism are 2 distinct terms. If Tom DeWeese is to be believed, communism actually sprouted in the aftermath of the Soviet defeat, even though there are similarities. But I'm not an expert on these terms or the complete history surrounding them, so I'll focus more on what doesn't work specifically in the context of the show. The idea of this trio being communist makes no sense, not only because they really don't understand the terminology, and honestly how could they, but it also goes against the rebellious personality Maya has always sported, along with the unique perspective Farkle has always had. Riley going overboard in an effort to help her friends is more in line with her character, but that's not an argument in her favor this time around. But what really kills this episode, even beyond those aforementioned critical missteps, is that not even Mr. Matthews himself gets the lesson right, because here, the lesson is taught in such a way that kind of discourages any form of group work, because doing that would be un-American or something, and spends way too much time on the cheating plotline. What this episode should have done is drop the socio-political elements to focus on the value of group work and individualism. The cheating thing should have been resolved in 2 minutes flat. They were wrong, they get punished, move on. And then use the rest of the episode to parlay the way they cheated into a lesson about legitimately working together to accomplish things that individuals cannot. but then take it one step further by allowing the trio to contribute to said project in their own unique ways. And just like that, you've got a solid episode that pushes the show's narrative forward. And if you really want to do something highbrow on top of that, make the group project itself political in nature, but just not too political. Just enough so that the trio doesn't have to agree on everything, since they're no longer communists in this alternate reality episode. And I'll even take it one step further than that. As long as we're talking about improvements, this new version will premiere in line with the production schedule. Then, show some friction in the group by having Farkle and Riley disagree on whatever topic they're working with. Why? Because now you can go back to that in Girl Meets STEM a few weeks later, where their issues doing classwork together have now been pre-established. All of a sudden, that conflict doesn't come out of left field as much, and you improve 2 episodes for the price of 1. All in all, this episode as is can best be described by Corey himself.
I don't need this.
And neither do we. Communism is number 1, so the list is finally done. As always, don't forget to share your own thoughts on what episodes just don't do it for you. But please, let's be civil about it. And of course, thanks for watching.